Okay, welcome back to the Tokyo Living podcast. We've got a three-peat back for his third time on the show, our resident medical expert, Dr. Tom Lomax. Tom, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. I didn't realize it was 3 times already.
Yes.
Very sick of me. Okay.
How's things on your end?
Yeah, good. I mean, it's busy as always, but it's good.
Yeah. Good. So if you're not from Tokyo, or if you are from Tokyo and you've been living under a rock and you don't know about Dr. Lomax, go back to our very first episode number 1, where we find out all about him and his career and his role at Tokyo Medical and Surgical. But for today, we're going to jump straight into the content of the show. We're going to be talking about vaccines today, not COVID vaccines, which is the main vaccine that everyone's talking about at the moment. If you are interested in that and you haven't already, go back and listen to episode number 8, where we have Dr. Deshpande, who gave a very good talk on the COVID vaccines. Today, we're going to be talking about childhood immunisation. Now, for people who are living out here, given the age demographic, especially in the expat population, we do have a lot of people who are raising young children. And obviously, immunisation is part of, it probably should be part of raising healthy children. And obviously, different countries have different regulations and different procedures regarding immunisation. So if you are not Japanese and you're raising children here, you obviously have to consider, aligning with the Japanese system to a certain degree based on what is compulsory out here, but also making sure that you're getting the necessary vaccinations for your home country and for expats, potentially a country or countries that you may be living in the future. So to start us off, Tom, perhaps if you can just talk through some of the major differences between the vaccinations between Japan and other countries, both in terms of the vaccinations that are given and also the timing of those vaccinations.
Yeah, Japan's not as different now as it was when I first started practicing here. So I came out here in 2008, and I mean, back then Japan had the lightest and probably the worst immunization schedule out of any of the developed countries. So
really, okay.
Hib vaccination against Haemophilus influenza B and pneumococcal vaccines weren't approved in Japan until quite a long time after they were in widespread use around the rest of the world. So when I started working here, you would have got more comprehensive vaccinations in Kenya than in Japan. And that improved quite a lot. I think 2010, 2011, when Japan decided to license those vaccines that weren't on the schedule. So now the core vaccinations that you get in the first year, so the combination vaccine, polio, Hib, pneumococcus, hepatitis B, rotavirus, I mean, that's pretty similar to the immunizations that you'll get in most other developed countries, in most European countries, the US, Australia, with some minor variations on the timing. And I guess the fact that in Japan, the vaccines are more sort of split up. So most countries now use a 6-in-1 combination vaccine. So when like we were kids, we were given a triple vaccine, diphtheria, tetanus, and tussis, whooping cough. And basically more things have been added into that combination vaccine. So now in most countries, it's 6 vaccinations. It's diphtheria, tetanus, tussis, hepatitis B, polio, and Hib, all in one shot. So Japan still doesn't do that. In Japan, you get a 4-in-1 vaccine, DTP and polio. And then the other 2 immunizations are given as separate jabs. So instead of getting everything in one needle, you get 3 separate needles. And that has to be repeated 3 times in Japan, 3, 4, and 5 months. So basically, those immunizations in Europe, America, Australia would be 3 injections given at intervals. In Japan, it's a total of 9. So, I mean, I guess it's sort of more jabs, but you get to the same place. So, I mean, I think anyone who just decides to go through the regular Japanese system and get all the immunizations that are funded by the Japanese government, there's not too much missing there. I guess where it varies, what you then have to look at is what your country of origin is and how often are you going there. So I have quite a lot of patients, for example, from the UK, and there are additional vaccines on the UK schedule, which are given in the UK and aren't given in Japan. And I'd say to my UK families, you need to look at both schedules, and you really need to vaccinate your kids so that they're sort of, they reach the required level in both countries. If you're going to go backwards and forwards, if you're only in Japan, probably just doing the Japanese vaccines is okay.
Okay, and so what are those ones, for example, that are given in the UK that aren't given here?
So in the UK and in quite a lot of other European countries, you get meningitis C and or meningitis B. So UK gives both of those. France and Germany just give men C but not men B. I think Australia gives men ACWY. So these are vaccinations against meningococcal meningitis, which is quite a rare infection, but it's extremely serious. Now, that kind of meningitis is exceptionally rare in Japan. So if you were only living in Japan, you probably wouldn't need to do those vaccines. But those infections are more common in many other countries. So, for example, if you were a British family and you were going back to the UK for, I don't know, 3 or 4 weeks in the summer and a week at the end of the year, probably would recommend that you did the meningitis vaccines that your kid would have got if they'd been in the UK on top of the Japanese schedule as a minimum.
Yeah. And what about other sort of main countries? Are there any major things that are different there?
I guess a lot of countries give hepatitis A as routine, usually at or soon after the first birthday. So, for example, US gives all children hepatitis A. And I think one of the areas that perhaps we as a clinic didn't used to be as proactive about is we have quite a lot of families who are from sub-Saharan Africa, often diplomatic families. And when they go back to their home countries, if they haven't been vaccinated to an appropriate standard for Africa, their kids definitely are at risk. So we had one family who went back without talking to us to sub-Saharan Africa, and one of their children got hepatitis A and actually was fine, wasn't terribly sick with it. But in retrospect, that was avoidable. So now when we have families who are living in Japan, but who return or frequently visit other Asian countries, South Asia or sub-Saharan Africa, then we try to make sure their kids are given hepatitis A and typhoid in some cases as well, which wouldn't be routinely given in Japan.
Right. And I guess just going back a bit, what has changed in the sort of, what is it, like 12 or 13 years since you've been practicing here? What parts of the vaccination system have changed?
Yeah, so the big two, I guess, are, as I mentioned before, Hib, which is Haemophilus influenza B, and pneumococcus. Right. Those are, relatively common early childhood infections that can cause things like pneumonias and nasty middle ear infections. But actually, if you look at acutely unwell children, so children who are admitted to hospital with septicemia and with meningitis, those two infections account for about 90% of hospital admissions in that category. And in most cases, those are preventable illnesses. So when I started working at Tokyo Medical and Surgical, we used to import those vaccines kind of off license because they weren't approved in Japan. And we gave them to the foreign community because they were standard in, pretty well all the countries that our patients were coming from. And kind of what happened when I first started working at the clinic is kind of word spread to the Japanese medical community that there was this one place that was giving these vaccines. And we used to get Japanese pediatricians would come in with their children because they were sort of going into work and managing these really severe infections, which they realized were preventable by vaccination. They sort of go home and look at their kids and go, oh, I don't want that happening to my son or my daughter. And then they sort of come into us and we give them these vaccines. So that was kind of 2008, 2009, 2010. And there was actually a sort of rising voice within the Japanese medical community and the media saying, look, these vaccines are given as standard everywhere else in the world. We really need to introduce them. And they were introduced and now they're given as standard. So that's a big improvement. And then since then, hepatitis B has also been added to the Japanese immunization schedule. And that's been standard in most other countries for a long time.
Yeah.
So it's kind of caught up, but relatively at a late stage.
Yeah. And why was it so far behind? Is it?
So, I mean, I think a lot of this goes back to problems they had with the immunization schedule back in the 90s. So they introduced the MMR vaccine in, I think, 1989, but they kind of made their own version of it. So they didn't use an MMR vaccine that was commercially available in the West. They sort of designed a Japanese MMR vaccine. And basically they had a bad mumps strain in it. And that caused not a very high number, but a certain number of fairly severe adverse reactions. And that was a sort of huge, that generated a lot of anxiety in Japan about vaccines and about novel vaccines, which kind of persists until today. So there's kind of quite a lot of anxiety, not just in the general population, but also in the regulators and in the government about introducing novel vaccines. So Japan's always been quite slow to do that and has required quite a lot of a push, actually.
Yeah. And I know we weren't going to discuss this tonight, but do you think that is going to affect people's sort of uptake of the COVID-19 vaccine?
I mean, it remains to be seen. I think, so a lot of people are in the foreign community, very frustrated by the delay in obtaining COVID vaccines in Japan.
Just a little bit.
One sort of silver lining to that cloud is that we've had plenty of time to watch these vaccines being deployed in other countries. And I think that has actually allayed, by, not everyone's concerns, but I think people realize now that in countries where vaccines have been administered, in a fairly comprehensive manner, like Israel, for example, they've been extremely safe and they've worked reasonably well. So I hope that will go some distance to allaying concerns and result in a better vaccine uptake here than would otherwise be the case. But, time will tell.
And then you mentioned the difference in injection course for the same vaccines being administered. What is the reasoning behind that? Do you know why they do it that way?
I think there's generally been a hesitancy just to import vaccines from overseas. So basically what you're left with is vaccines that Japanese companies manufacture. And because there are no Japanese companies that manufacture the 5 or 6 in 1 shots, they've got these kind of more split up immunizations instead. I think that's what it boils down to. And that kind of cuts both ways. So they've been kind of quite slow to bring in new vaccines that have been proven to be of significant benefit in other countries. But they've also been quite slow to sort of rationalize the immunization schedule and perhaps withdraw or limit the use of vaccines that are, no longer quite as important as they used to be. So I guess the one that I'm thinking of most there is the BCG vaccine, which I get a lot of people coming in to ask me about because Japan still, gives BCG as standard. I think mandate is the wrong word because vaccines aren't mandatory in Japan. You can't be denied access to education if you're not vaccinated, for example. But it's a core vaccine. So BCG used to be given in European countries as well. I've got my BCG scar here. I don't know if you can see it, but it's there. But in the UK and in many other European countries, when the tuberculosis rate fell, I think to below, I think it's about 20 cases per 100,000 people per year, BCG vaccine was deemed no longer worthwhile because it's not a very effective vaccine. It only gives you about 20 or 30% protection against TB.
Oh, really? Okay.
It's so unlikely to catch TB
Anyway, yeah.
But if vaccinate a whole cohort of 1 million children and prevent one infection, you can argue what is that cost effective? Is that an appropriate use of resources? So in Japan, tuberculosis has now fallen to a level that the World Health Organization and in fact some Japanese TB specialists who I've spoken to have said, well, actually, we don't really need to give BCG anymore but it's still been left on the schedule. So
Right.
more or less for historical reasons, I would say.
Mm,
I mean, it's
yeah.
not harmful, so I'm not saying that it's bad to have it. Just the benefit of giving it is very, very small. So, I think it would be sort of the last one on my list of priority for vaccination.
Yeah, and there's potentially cosmetic reasons not to have it.
Yeah, I mean, it gives you the Japanese one, as some people may be aware, it looks like a QRL code. It's like a stampy thing with like 9 spikes. So you get a total of 18 small spots on your arm. I mean, some people don't like the cosmetic appearance. I don't think it's awful, but I do have some people who want to avoid that. So, I mean, there's a way around that in people who decide they do want their kid to have BCG, but they don't want the scar on the arm. We've done it on the bottom of the
foot.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I've heard that as well.
I think that's parental choice, really. I don't feel very strongly that the vaccine should or shouldn't be given. I think I tend to
Sure.
defer that to people's individual preference.
Sure. And just pain-wise for the kid, the stamp, it's no more painful than a standard injection?
Having given a lot of these vaccines, I think kids are as upset by a regular subcutaneous or intramuscular shot as BCG. They maybe sort of cry for 30 seconds. And then because you're giving these vaccines to like babies who are sort of maybe 4, 5, 6, 7 months old, I mean, they very quickly sort of, forget and move on to the next thing. If you sort of distract them quickly after the vaccination, they recover and forget it quite soon. So I don't think that's a huge issue.
Yeah. Is that a factor, though, that some parents will opt for the foreign schedule over the Japanese because there's less injections and just less trauma to the child?
Yeah. Basically, as I said, for the vaccinations that, for example, in Australia, you get 6-in-1 combination vaccine and a pneumococcal vaccine at 2, 3, and 4 months. That's 2 shots, 3 visits, total of 6 needles. And to get the same coverage on the Japanese system, it's not 6 needles, it's 12. And mostly people don't want to give their kids 4 shots at 1 visit. So they'll typically split it up into 6 visits instead of 3. So there's sort of kind of more needles, more foot flow to get to exactly the same place. And I think for that reason, yes, we've got a number of families who just prefer to go with the because we and several other clinics in Japan will import vaccines so they're compliant with foreign schedules. Yeah.
Yep. Okay. And then the way the system works, if you're going under the Japanese system, you basically receive a postcard in the mail, and you can do that at any clinic. Is it sort of ward-based or?
Yeah. So, I mean, that's like the one bit of the Japanese public health system that we've been able to access, because as a foreign doctor, I've got special dispensation to practice in Japan. I've got a license that allows me to practice in the foreign community. But the conditions of me transferring my medical license to Japan and getting a Japanese medical license are that I don't work under Japanese national health insurance.
Yeah.
But vaccinations are not part of Japanese national health insurance. They're a completely separate system. They're administered through the ward offices.
Yep.
So each ward office has got a slightly different system. And we found out about 10 years ago that we could register to be on that system. So yeah, I mean, me and my colleagues are registered to do sort of Japanese system vaccinations. And I have a number of families that come in with the voucher vaccines they receive from their ward office and will administer those just as they could, and they can get those vaccines administered at any other clinic.
And so just to touch back on that, so it's controlled by the wards, but the clinic doesn't have to be in that particular ward. So if I get my vouchers from Megoroku, I can come and see your clinic in Miyatoku.
There are very, very few exceptions to this. Almost all the vouchers work anywhere in the Tokyo 23 ward area. So if you're living outside of Tokyo, like let's say you're living in Yokohama and you get a voucher, you can't bring that into Tokyo, it won't work.
Okay.
You have to use it in Yokohama. But if you live in Adachiku and you've got vouchers, you can bring them to Minatoku or take them to Shibuya, any other ward, and they'll be honoured. There are a few exceptions to that, like rotavirus, which is an oral vaccine given to prevent a relatively nasty diarrheal infection. That one, I think, is still on a ward-by-ward basis. So if you get a voucher for rotavirus in Shibuya ward, then I think this has changed quite a lot over the years. I think that voucher only you have to use in that same ward, because that vaccine's not kind of regarded as, national standards should be given everywhere across the board.
Okay.
The other vaccines all transfer.
Right. And what age would that usually be given at? Yeah.
Rotavirus is given alongside the vaccines that babies receive at 2, 3, 4, 5 months, and it's 2 or 3 doses depending on which vaccine you go with.
Yeah. Okay. And the age schedule for Japanese vaccines compared to other countries is fairly similar?
There's subtle differences between countries, but really, I think if you sort of step back from it and say, what's the overall intention of the primary series of vaccinations, the vaccinations that we give in the first year? But basically, when you're born, you've actually got quite good immunity against lots of common infections, because antibodies that your mum's making get transferred into your body and they persist until about 6 months. Right. So if you look at immunity to things like measles, chickenpox, influenza, blah, 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 if you look at antibody levels in very small babies, they're actually quite good. So, very little babies can get infections, but it's actually not as common as you'd think. Now, if you don't do anything, you didn't vaccinate a kid, after about 6 months, those antibodies start to disappear. And then the kid's got to basically learn to fight all infections by being exposed to them, getting sick, and then generating immunity. And that's a pretty hit and miss haphazard process. And if you go back to the 19th century before immunizations, that would sort of kill off maybe something like sort of 30 to 60% of an age cohort, as the kids got all these infections, and some of them recovered from them, some of them didn't. So what we do now is, during those first 6 months of life, we're trying to kind of educate babies' immune systems to fight off all of these more serious infections. And that means giving vaccinations, usually in most countries 3 times, although some countries only do it twice, before 6 months. Right. So, and you'll sort of see variations on a theme. So like UK is like 2, 3, 4 months. Australia and US are 2, 4, 6 months. New Zealand is like 6 weeks, 3 months, and 5 months. But I mean, they're all kind of getting 3 shots into the kid with a minimum of a 4-week interval between shots, and you should finish all the shots by 6 months. So in Japan, for the Hib and the pneumococcal vaccines, it is 2, 3, and 4 months. And for the 4-in-1 combination vaccine, DTP polio and DTP polio, it's 3, 4, and 5 months. Okay. So they kind of don't quite all line up either. So that's why it's quite a lot of visits if you're going Japanese system.
Yeah.
You can do a bit later than that and it will still be safe.
Yeah, sure. So if you're going by the Japanese system, as long as you've got those vaccines covered, then you'll be covered in your home country. If that's from the timing isn't that important for.
No, if you follow the Japanese timings, then that you don't have to adjust the Japanese timings to be sort of in sync with your own home country. The only thing you have to do is look at what else your home country is giving, like as I mentioned, the meningococcal meningitis vaccines, and kind of add those in basically.
Yeah. And is there anything else on the Japanese schedule that isn't on the foreign schedules that are perhaps optional? And yeah.
So, I mean, the one that everyone asks me about is Japanese encephalitis.
Yeah.
So because of the name, people think, oh, well, encephalitis, that means like swelling of the brain, and it's something that happens in Japan, so I better get vaccinated against that. And Japanese encephalitis is still on the Japanese vaccination schedule, but it's become, vanishingly rare in Japan. So, I mean, if you go north from Tokyo, Hokkaido has never had Japanese encephalitis, and I don't think Tohoku's had any for decades either. The part of Japan we're in, like Tokyo and the surrounding Kanto region, no one's been infected with Japanese encephalitis since 1994. So it's been, 27 years now. If you go to the far south and west of Japan, like rural Shikoku, rural Kyushu, and Okinawa, there is still a small number of infections, mostly in farming communities. So, I mean, does that mean all children in Japan still need Japanese encephalitis? I think that's debatable, but it's a safe vaccine and it's still listed as core. Although actually we've just heard that there's a manufacturing problem with that vaccine. So it's in short supply and it may be unavailable for the next year. I mean, I think I'd say to people who've decided they do want their kids to have Japanese encephalitis and find they can't locate a supplier, not to worry about it, just to defer it until it's back in stock.
Sure. Okay. Any others?
I think those are the main two. Those are the main two that are on the Japanese schedule that people ask me, do I really need them? I'd say that's debatable, the BCG and the Japanese encephalitis. And the other one that people sort of get, I don't know, not tripped up on, but I'll sometimes ask about is chickenpox, is varicella. So again, there's kind of a bit of variation on how countries manage chickenpox. Most countries now vaccinate against it. So most European countries, North America, Australasia, and most Asian countries just give kids a chickenpox vaccine. Some countries, the UK, I think Sweden and the Netherlands, don't vaccinate kids against chickenpox. And their sort of take is that chickenpox isn't serious. It doesn't give you meningitis. It can't leave you deaf or permanently disabled, like, for example, measles or mumps could. So it's okay just to let kids catch it naturally, and then they'll have immunity from that. I mean, the weakness of that as an approach is that if you catch chickenpox later in life, it can be quite nasty. And if you catch chickenpox when you're pregnant, it can damage your baby quite badly. So, like, let's say you've got 3 daughters like me, and they're brought up in Japan, and you decide not to give them chickenpox vaccine because, like, UK doesn't give it, it's probably not that important. And because you're living in Japan, your kid's probably not going to catch chickenpox because it just doesn't circulate. So let's say one or more of your daughters then move back to the UK. They've never had chickenpox, they're not immune, and then let's say they're first exposed to it when they get pregnant, then that can cause a fairly serious problem. So, I mean, I think I tend to leave that to people's individual discretion, but I generally say to people that, particularly if you've got girls, if you're living in Japan, it's probably better to do what the Japanese do, which is to vaccinate against chickenpox as part of the Japanese schedule, which is what actually my daughters have done.
Yeah.
But I mean, again, I think that is down to parental discretion, and people can make an informed decision about that.
Sure. Okay. And then, I guess going back to the system. So if you're doing it under the Japanese system, you'll get that postcard. If you're not, then basically you're paying out of pocket, or
So I mean,
private insurance or something.
So we've got some people who've got private insurance that covers vaccinations, and people like diplomats, for example, who don't get those vouchers because they're sort of here outside of the Japanese system. So those families will come to us and their vaccinations done, privately. And it's actually quite expensive because a lot of the vaccines that we use are imported and that can cost. So for people who've got access to the Japanese system, get the Japanese vouchers, and, for whom cost is an issue, they can use the Japanese system. It means slightly more visits and more needles, but it works and it immunizes the kids to an appropriate standard, basically at no cost. What an immunization system should do.
Then I just want to go back to one thing you touched on before, that I've heard from, I guess, more of rumours circulating in the past, that if your child wasn't vaccinated, say for BCG, that would affect their ability to get into schools and things like that. But that's not the case, and that's not the case with anything. Like, you're not going to be...
No.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you don't vaccinate your kid at all, the ward office will send someone round to your house, or will try to contact you, and they will strongly recommend that your children are vaccinated. So, I mean, I know this because families who I've vaccinated off the Japanese system who haven't used the vouchers, they've been sent by the ward office. The ward office notice, because they send out these vouchers and they wait for the back copies to come back in again, so they know that that kid who they issued a voucher to has now been vaccinated. So if they see, like a year after issuing all these vouchers, that none of them have come back, then they strongly suspect that kid hasn't been vaccinated, and they'll sort of check up on them. So, but I mean, if families push back and say, no, we're not vaccinating at all, there isn't any kind of legal recourse, and kids can't actually be excluded from the education system here. I mean, in practice, Japan has high rates of vaccination, so there are relatively few unvaccinated kids in the Japanese education system, but that's not because of any kind of legislation or penalties or fines or anything like that, which we're starting to see being introduced in countries where vaccine uptake rates are poor, and there have been sort of problems as a consequence.
Sure. Okay. That's good to know. Anything else that you think that foreigners living in Japan should know about the vaccination system here?
No, I mean, I think when the people who sort of struggle are often families who've got several children and have moved around a lot and have found that their vaccinations have fallen across like 2 or 3 borders. So I've had sort of families who maybe have had the first 2 children in Europe, and then they've lived in Singapore, and then they've moved to Hong Kong, and then they've gone to the States, and they've come to Japan. And the vaccinations have been done as a sort of hodgepodge in those different countries. And then often you do have to just go and see someone who's got a bit of experience with this and have them like list up all the vaccines your kids have had, and like pick out the ones that are missing. Because I mean, I'm pretty sure that every family that I see who've got sort of 3 or 4 kids that have lived in 3 or 4 countries, someone is going to be missing something. And I mean, I've got a lot of sympathy for that, because life's busy and it's not the only thing on people's minds.
Yeah.
You occasionally do have to kind of get all the records together, sit down with someone who knows what's going on, and have them just go through it all properly.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right. Well, thank you very much. That's been extremely helpful and informative as always. Really appreciate your time tonight, and look forward to getting you back on the show soon.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thanks, Tom. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.